Let's unpack this further now with Professor Nando Sigona. He is a professor of international migration and forced displacement and director of the Institute for Research into Superdiversity at the University of Birmingham in England. Professor, very good evening. Thanks so much for speaking to us. Now, please explain the rationale or lack thereof. Now, an asylum seeker makes their way to Britain seeking asylum. They're then sent to Rwanda for processing. Rwanda then says, yes, you have the right to stay in Britain, but as a token of good measure, you get to stay in Rwanda. End of story. That doesn't make much sense to me. Is that how it's going to work?
Yeah, I mean, this is the novelty of this plan. In the past, we have had several times attempts, more or less implemented, to offshore the responsibility on the assessment of the asylum claims. For example, the idea that some Western countries would ask other countries to process the asylum claims, and if people were found to have a genuine cases, they would be then transferred to their own country. In this case, what we see is that a completely transfer of the responsibility vis-à-vis refugees and asylum seekers, saying, well, we're transferring people to a third country, in this case Rwanda, but I personally would have the same objection even if it was the Maldives. It's not the point about Rwanda, it's the fact that a rich Western country was one of the core party in the development of the international refugee regime is now basically abandoning its own responsibility towards refugees and people needing protection. So what is happening now is that even if Rwanda found the person having a genuine case for refugee protection, the person basically stays in Rwanda. There's no right to travel to the UK in any ways. And what is unclear is that what may be the responsibility of the United Kingdom in case something happened to this person. You know, is there any responsibility by or accountability for the British government if things go wrong?
Now, the British government says it welcomes refugees who come by approved immigration routes. What are those immigration routes?
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. But the problem is, in the new migration system that has emerged since Brexit, the legal routes are extremely limited. So basically, at the moment, the only way a refugee can come to Britain is through a resettlement program, legally. So what they're trying to do is to completely close down the possibility for people to apply for asylum in the United Kingdom.
Okay, I'd hope to hear a little bit more about that. Now, something that's happening next week is that Prince Charles, whom I believe is anti the repatriation of these individuals, is going to Rwanda, and obviously he's going to have a conversation with President Paul Kagame. In your mind, what is that conversation likely to produce? It's
basically sending a signal to the British public and to the British establishment. What is also important, there are two things I think that are interesting and important to bear in mind. One is that if you look at the current surveys in terms of among the Tory voters and within the Tories party, there is a broad support for this policy. So while there is a part of the population which is really opposing it, there has been a lot of NGO involvement, there has been also the church has been very vocal against this policy, the international organization. There is, the core voters of the current government are still behind the Prime Minister and this policy. The other element which would be very important to understand is also to see how this policy is seen from the perspective of Rwanda. And what we know, I mean, from Britain, where I am, we really hear very little about it. So that's also an angle that would be very interesting, that getting a bit more viewing from the UK.
Now, final thoughts on this, Professor. A full trial of the legality of the UK government plan is due to be heard sometime in July. What are some of the arguments that will be heard from both sides, if you will?
I think one of the core arguments here that the British government is going to try to use is that under the previous Labour Party government, under Tony Blair in particular, they introduced the idea that of third safe countries. So if an asylum seeker had crossed through a safe third countries, that country should be responsible for assessing the asylum case. This is a principle that is also somehow part of the European Union approach to asylum through what is called the Dublin regulations. Interestingly, though, when they were applying this approach was only applied within Europe and only applied, in a sense, within the framework of the European Union in particular. In this case, in a sense, the British government is sort of saying we are applying the same idea of Rwanda as a safe country first, but there is a gap there, because in the first case, the idea was that the responsibility was remaining within the space of the European Union. In this case, they are basically transferring in a completed third country. In many ways, this policy is very much the fruit of the result of Brexit and all the shift and transformation that has started to occur since the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union.
Professor, I appreciate your time this evening. Professor Nando Sigona, Chair of International Migration and Forced Displacement and Director of the Institute for Research into Superdiversity at the University of Birmingham.